Oh, for a soft and gentle wind, I heard a fair one cry. But give to me the snoring breeze, and white waves heaving high. And white waves heaving high, my lads, the good ship's tight and free. The world of waters is our home, and merry men are we.
I named this ship Voyager.
Hey! Hey!
In 1955, the RAN took delivery of HMAS Melbourne. With her angled flight deck and steam catapult, she was to become the pride of the RAN for years to come.
What was the...
The RAN quickly acquired the skills to operate Melbourne to peak efficiency. Maneuvering at sea under operational conditions required great care.
For flying operations, the carrier has a rescue destroyer known as the RESDES. RESDES is ahead of the carrier for launch. That way, using just red lights on its yard arm, it acts as a stable horizon for the aircraft taking off. Now, for land-ons, the RESDES then goes onto the quarter, the stern but slightly to one side of the carrier. So if there's a series of operations going where aircraft are taking off and then landing, the RESDES has to move. Now, at the time when this is happening, quite often ships are altering course. You may be in a formation. So the RESDES really has to know where he's going and what the carrier's doing.
In 1964, after years of safe operations, Melbourne was involved in the worst peacetime disaster in RAN history. During nighttime exercises, Melbourne collided with her RESDES destroyer, HMAS Voyager.
Suddenly I became aware that Melbourne appeared relative to us to be closing fairly fast, and I became aware that this was a collision course, and watched with horror over the last perhaps 30 seconds as a collision became inevitable out of the still night from Voyager's bridge. The cry just a little prior to impact was collision stations, and the collision occurred. Melbourne cut straight through Voyager as Voyager came across her bows. There were small fires as she would slice straight through. A lot of steam appeared, and of course Voyager heeled very hard over to starboard to an angle perhaps of 30 degrees. So I wasn't quite sure that the ship wasn't going to roll right over. I suppose my first thought was that I'll have to swim, and very stupidly I discarded my shoes at the time. Not a very brave act. She subsequently righted herself, and thereafter I had quite a lot to do and actually regretted not having shoes. Of course, the first action that was apparent to us was to release the engine room crew from the forward engine room. The superstructure was down in that area, and there was a certain amount of distortion, and with some bars, and we managed to prise open the door to the watertight door to the engine room, and release the crew from there.
"82 men of Voyager's crew of 293 were lost in a tragedy that profoundly shocked the nation and the RAN.
For the Yeoman, past to Canberra. Join me, formation Yankee.
Yes, you're up.
Starboard. Course 090, speed 15, distance bar 4,000 yards.
Increase 15. Revolutions 121. Revolutions 121.
Since the days of Captain Cook, Australian waters had always been protected by the Royal Navy. With Federation in 1901, however, the new Australian nation increasingly felt the need for its own navy. After years of discussion, the RAN was eventually designated the Royal Australian Navy in 1911.
Shut up, mate. Yeah, right up next to the driver.
Shut the door, drive, can you please? Good on you. Hit your button, that's it.
Yeah, we won't fall out.
How's that for
Carry on a wreck bike. He's somewhere.
That's all right. That's all right. Which is it, Matt? Is that one that's 5?
Is there anyone that feels might have a bit of trouble going up or down the ladder? Would you go first, please? The Navy will help you on board. No?
You're going to come through after?
Yeah, I'll come through. I'll come through later. All right.
Simon Russell down there with the camera.
Russ, just turn around for a second. No, I got you in it as well.
See you later.
Okay.
Yeah, I will on the way back. 2 o'clock you'll be back.
Yeah. So I would imagine.
Okay, have a good day.
Yeah, we moved
You're worried to see the faces out there?
Yes.
Nice to see you.
Can you find him without his band down? You find him strange? And you should have seen the dates you cut it off. That was the screen, wasn't it? The day you cut his beard off. That's where I'm living now. Which side's it on?
Sorry?
Which side's it going to go? Going to go right round?
Not the Huskisson motor in?
No, the Albatross is now. So you couldn't get in at Huskisson anywhere.
No, we were lucky to get in too.
Mary, come on.
We have finally got on HMAS Swan.
Want me to take a couple of years? You want?
Linda had to have a nervous cigarette.
It's not really that good.
We have a ship's company of some 240, and with the additional guests, you can appreciate that we are rather crowded. However, our purpose in life today is to make you sincerely welcome. We are here to provide you with a service, so please look upon it that way. Anything you like, please ask, and we'll do our best to provide. What's going to happen today is that we've produced a program which will give a rough outline of how we see the day progressing. However, it's entirely flexible. For example, if we proceed through the heads in about another half an hour or so and find there's a 4-metre swell running, then perhaps I'll have a conversation with a number of you just to determine exactly what we'll do about that. So it must be flexible. Unfortunately, the sea's a bit like that. There are certain things within the ship which we can show you, and part of our program today will be perhaps those that are interested. Perhaps we could divide you up into small groups later on and give you a tour of the ship. We have medical facilities on board, so if you feel as though you need to avail yourself of those, then there's a doctor and my medical staff on board will be only too happy to do what they can for you. Meldemur is a real thing, so those of you that would like early relief from it, then again the PO Med, who's the bearded chap standing up there with those horrible looking boxes of tablets holding up in his hand, approach him and he'll be able to perhaps provide early support for you. So as I said, we are here to help. The ship, we can show you everything about the ship. There's nothing that is top secret or anything like that, so if you'd like to go and see the boiler room or the engine room, then please do so. One point I'll make early is the ship is currently suffering from a very, very common disease in steamships called condenseritis. And it means basically we have a cooling system in the ship where we run the steam through condensers to turn it back into water so we can make it to steam again. And to do that, it goes through a saltwater cooling system. And if you get a hole between the pipes of the salt water and the pipes of the fresh water, then obviously that's undesirable, which is what's happening now. So the ship will sail with one engine available, the other one's obviously there if we need it. And so you'll notice that perhaps as we go out, those of you that go to the bridge will see the helmsman carrying a bit of wheel. That's because we'll be on one engine. And it's not because the other one's not available, it's merely that we're trying to keep it cool so that when we come back this afternoon, the engineers can can open up the condenser and have a look at it, and of course if it's hot then they'll have to wait for 12 hours. I think perhaps in all foresight I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, but hopefully we'll be able to complete our ceremony before the worst of it comes through. So welcome on board. The EXO and my team will now detail the day's program, and as I said to you, if you want anything, please just ask. Thank you very much.
You shouldn't have to worry about today. We carry a saltwater activated battery. This battery, all you have to do is pull the plugs out of there, and it'll light the light up. The light will light for about 16 hours full production. It comes with a whistle, strop which may be lifted up to the ship.
Roommate facilities across the road. Do you want to make your own or do you want me to make?
No,
Okay then. Just over the road here.
just black with plain one. Yeah, no, I don't want to get it.
You just have to go about 2 or 3 at a time because it's only a small block.
Only at sea. Morning, Rufus. How you feel now? Oh, she's a swaying now. Here we go. Look at this. We're a swaying now. And it's a nice swell. It's a beautiful swell. Linda's hanging on like grim death there. Well, I carry myself. Oh, I don't mind it, but it's my special weather. And there's another big swell. There's the heads out there.
Now to break this off, yeah.
She's swinging and swaying.
There's potentially not unusual. Condenseritis.
Yeah.
So looks like we're going to do a condenser clean out, replace a few tubes.
You might want to see the video, mate.
5.
Linda, how is it, dear? It's not rough, is it?
Over the site of the HMAS Voyager to commemorate the 27th anniversary of their loss at sea. I will now ask Walter Wilson to conduct the service.
I feel privileged that I take this role this morning. I'm grateful for the opportunity, very conscious of how appropriate it is to have a ship supplied over the spot. I'm sure that's very meaningful to those survivors out here, meaningful especially to those who are grieving the loss of loved ones. I'm sure that all of you here would have me say this in one of the written life. To me, within the darkness. Whoever lives and believes in me, they're hymns which are particularly appropriate. Some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters.
For my sake will find it. And what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits the angels and the glory of his Father? And then he will repay every man.
The address this morning,
27 years ago. Beyond the site's land, there is little to distinguish the sea in one place or another. But this place is their eternal home. There is peace here now. Both Voyager and Melbourne are gone. The thunder, the violence and the terror of their colliding has given way to the silence of the seas with their soothing reassurance and their great timelessness. Those who conduct their business upon them. Being at sea in a naval ship during manoeuvres can be dangerous. So many lives, still 27 years later, seems so pointless. After 2 searching inquiries, we're a little closer to knowing why the accident occurred. Someone said, we were firm together, they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. George Cross, the highest peacetime bravery honour, was conferred posthumously on Buck Rogers. He was the oldest man on board. Midshipman Kerry Marriott lost his "We will never" because we could never forget you.
The sea, O Trinity of love and power, our brethren shield in danger's hour. On rock and tempest, fire and foe, protect them wheresoe'er they go. Us evermore
snowman equal quality of life. Strength of the faint heart, performance, healthy and
Yeah, we're heading way back now. Linda's having a cigarette. There's the heads. There's Linda. How's now, Linda? We're nearly inside the heads, love. Come on.
Put your head on. Equality in this mess.
Yeah, equality. Yeah, I think.
There's no ladies lose.
There is.
You still got Dad on? Put Dad on.
No, I'm too big. I've got to buy a case of beer.
What? Oh yeah, you got to buy the beer now.
Don't worry about it.
Nah. Some more money?
Nah, it's all right.
Because I could buy a case of beer for the mess.
Yeah, hold it in front of the camera.
If you expose one's private parts.
I didn't do that. I did that.
A blessing in disguise. Put you off your beer.
Talk about putting matchsticks in the head.
That's technically.
Ah, well done, fellas.
Sorry?
Technically,
This is the hospitality on the Swan, mate. It's unreal.
Yes.
See you later, Brownie. Thanks for your hospitality.
I've got one thing over here.
Thank you.
His mum.
She's waving. Did you see her there?
Yeah, I saw her.
You just spotted her?
Can't see him. Oh yeah.
there's
HMAS Voyager 27 years ago. As we remember them, we would offer our deep sympathy to their loved ones. We pray that they and we will, especially as we in many ways face stress and strain and sorrow in life. In God's care, we can only ever leave our loved ones, our shipmates, our friends. But let us never forget the priceless words of the Lord Jesus Christ. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. God will hear us. God will bless us as we offer our prayers and as we make this commemoration this afternoon. And raised the stormy wind which lifted up the waves of the sea. staggered like drunken men and were at their wits' ends. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. There's no man in this. The man may lay down his life for his friend. You are my friend if you do what I command you. Let us bow in prayer. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore. Amen. The address, be seated, please. The address will be given by Lieutenant Tom Frankson of Jarvis Bay.
Of course, is an unmistakably naval place, named after one of the greatest seamen of all time, Admiral Sir John Jarvis, victor at the Cape of St Vincent in the battle known as the glorious 1st of June 1794. It has been since the time Captain Cook took refuge here, a safe haven for naval ships and their sailors. Indeed, it was from this bay that HMAS Voyager proceeded to see the adjacent naval exercise area beyond Point Perpendicular on the morning of the 10th of February 1964. Over the previous weekend, the men of Voyager had enjoyed the pleasures of the bay with their ship at anchor. It was a time of rest and relaxation, peace and serenity before returning to the open waters in what would be a hectic work-up period prior to returning to Southeast Asia to the Commonwealth Strategic Reserve. In the 7 years since her commissioning in 1957, Voyager had earned a reputation for hard work and for great efficiency. It was a proud tradition the men of Voyager sought to uphold in early 1964 as they worked to make their ship once again ship-shape after a refit. A little over 12 hours later, Voyager would be no more. Events leading to the collision have been recounted many times. At the sunset of the calm, moonless night, Voyager was 2,000 yards ahead of the RAF flagship aircraft carrier HMAS Melbourne, which is engaged in flying operations 20 miles off Jarvis Bay. At 8 minutes to 9, Voyager was ordered astern of Melbourne Plainguard Station. The destroyer correctly altered her course to starboard and away from the carrier before, and inexplicably to this very day, starting a long, continuous turn to port that led to the ship's colliding just 4 minutes later. The destroyer was cut in two towards the rear of the bridge. The bow section
Errol Stafford News, Bruce Lees Carrington, Kerry Francis Marion, George Middle, Ronald William Porter, Warren Jackson Lutz, Leonard Bruce Fleming, Eric Leonard O'Leary, Kevin John Davis, Brian Miller, Kevin Charles Tate, Kevin Cullen, Robin Adrian Devon.
I got, but I've got something. I know what he said.
Yeah, I knew you should buy.
Must be an interesting exercise, gauging the public response. That's right. Drawing a difference between that initial emotive response and really how sincere they are in wanting. That's right.
And it's made worse because this awful book trade that they're mixed up with, the bookshops have the right of return.
Yes.
So you can get the help that you want.
So should we go and have a look where where the speakers are taking? Sure. That's a big deal. Yes. I'm not normal.
Yeah, lead the way. I'm
right, okay.
Well, normally that sort of request goes absolutely nowhere near the Chief of Naval Staff, but this one was different. Uninhibited access would be required to naval archives, files, personal correspondence, classified signals, naval board minutes, all would be open to the public gaze that had never previously been contemplated. And whilst over a quarter of a century had passed since that momentous event, there was a danger of opening old wounds, and certainly there was a danger of attracting unfavourable publicity to Navy. Well, that decision was not an easy one, and I can assure you that my approval was not lightly given, but what persuaded me was my very strong belief that there was much to be learnt by the new generation of naval officers from a professional study of all that had occurred between 1964 and 1968. Furthermore, I believe that the emotion of the time, with the attendant mass of media comment, had left a residual confusion in the minds of the public. And I was also confident that the Navy of today is mature enough, with a sufficient standing in the eyes of the community, to cope with any criticism that may arise. Well, I'm pleased to say Tom completed his thesis last year, and only last Friday was advised that he had been awarded his doctorate. And so Where Fate Calls draws heavily upon that thesis, and thus has a sound scholastic basis. Well, now, before I address some of the specifics of Tom Crane's book, I would like to make some comment, and it is a personal comment, about command at sea. And I do so because it is central to the story, and over my years in the Navy I have heard some surprise expressed at the perceived harshness with which a commanding officer may have been dealt when things go wrong. The level of responsibility borne by those in command is extraordinarily high by community standards, and a captain draws from that responsibility an authority given to no others of his rank. The acceptance of that responsibility is aspired to by every seaman officer worth his salt, and none would want to abrogate one iota of it. It is the challenge which makes it a privilege to command and the adrenaline to run. But it also demands professionalism of the highest order, and I know of no Navy that deals kindly with those who fail. In writing this book, Tom set out with 4 objectives. The first was twofold: to describe the loss of Voyager and the events immediately before and after the collision, and to account for the 4-year aftermath. The second was to offer an explanation as to why the collision occurred and why 2 Royal Commissions concluded that the causes were inexplicable. The third was to assess the effect both the disaster and the inquiries that followed had on the Royal Australian Navy in the immediate and longer term. And the fourth was to look at why the loss of Voyager became a political and media cause célèbre. I have no doubt that each reader will come to his or her own judgment on the extent to which Lieutenant Frame has achieved his objectives. For my part, I believe that he's done so, but I am very conscious of the remarks made by Justice Asprey, a member of the Royal Commission, that's the second Royal Commission, who in writing to the author said, "It is not only a waste of time, but also an unreasonable course to make conclusive apportionments of blame for the happening of an incident where there is an absence of the relevant facts, leaving only a one-sided version of the operative cause or causes of the happening of that incident." Well, I think there is a note of caution there that is worth remembering. I'm also very conscious that in this group here today, there are many who were personally involved in some way in the range of circumstances surrounding the Melbourne Voyager saga, which really started in 1963, the year before, and extended through to 1968. They will certainly have their own view of what occurred, and it may well be different to that expressed by Tom in his book. But I would hope that the totality of the story as now told, admittedly with hindsight, will help place things in a better perspective. In my view, it was a story that had to be told, and it is fortuitous that we have in Navy a young officer, Tom Frame, with Tom Frame's passion for history, the ability to analyse the events of the past, and more importantly, the skill to bring it together in a very readable form. And my hope is that this book will provide some of the balance that was lacking 28 years ago, because there is no doubt in my mind that those who rushed into print at the time, with their own versions of what occurred, did little to serve the goal of objectivity. And of course, it is very easy to fall into the trap of emotion when there is a personal involvement. I say as strongly as I can, where fate calls is not a whitewash of Navy or its people, nor is it an attempt at investigative journalism seeking to sensationalise a tragedy which should not have occurred. Lieutenant Frame is a historian, and his aim has been to set out the facts of history as documented in the public record and in the memories of those involved. And in several cases, he has exercised his own judgment and reached conclusions with which some will not agree. But that is no reason why the book should not have been written, and possibly therein lies one of the greatest changes in Navy today. There is a far greater openness than there was a quarter of a century ago. The individual, regardless of rank, is encouraged to have his say. There is a willingness to acknowledge that there may well be better ways of doing things, and that those of junior rank have something to contribute. Well, earlier I said what the book wasn't. What it is a story about people, not just naval officers and sailors, but also about prime ministers, politicians, public servants, judges and lawyers, doctors and others. It is about their strengths and weaknesses and the failings which we all share. It is also a commentary on the history of the Royal Australian Navy from its beginning as a colonial offshoot of the Royal Navy to where it stands today. That is, a totally Australian Navy with an Australian perspective of its strategic role, Australian attitudes in its personal relations, and an Australian pride in its achievements. And in the telling of that previous period, it serves to remind us that what is good for another country is not necessarily good for our own. Whilst I have dealt with the naval aspects of the book, there is much more to it than that, and Tom, very correctly in my view, devotes a considerable attention to the two Royal Commissions and how they unfolded. In the 1968 parliamentary debate, Lance Barnard said, "The debate tonight is the culmination of an extraordinary sequence of events. There is no parallel in either Australian military history or legal history for this incredible reversal of the findings of a Royal Commission by a second Royal Commission. And as far as I know, that precedent stands. In fact, even the second Royal Commission failed to satisfy John Jess, the prime mover for the second investigation. In his speech to Parliament, he not only claimed that the Commissioners showed a logical inconsistency, but also said, "No matter what the Commissioners have said in their report, I retain the right to disagree with their decisions." There were some, both inside and outside Navy, who questioned whether any Royal Commission should have been held, arguing that it would be more appropriate to have held a naval inquiry. Leslie Irwin, again in Parliament during that debate, suggested we should have flown in admirals from both the Canadian and the Royal Navies to do the job. One of his concerns was that Royal Commissions appeared to need some sort of scapegoat. And so is it any wonder that the public were confused then? And I would suggest all the more reason why the book should have been written now. But having said all that, I doubt whether Sir Robert Menzies really had any choice in setting up the first Royal Commission, and certainly given the political lobbying that occurred, I don't think Harold Holt had any choice but to order a second. Nevertheless, I have never known a Naval Board of Inquiry to do anything but tackle the task to the limit of its members' professional capabilities. But unfortunately, there is an innate Australian perception that inquiries internal to any organisation, even when conducted publicly, will be less than objective. Of course, some level that same criticism at Royal Commissions, but where the event is of such magnitude as the Melbourne Voyager disaster, I can't help but feel that an external inquiry is best. It was hard at the time for Navy to accept that the matter was to be taken out of their hands, but perhaps that was part of Navy's lesson in growing up. But it may also be that those responsible for the conduct of future Royal Commissions may still be able to learn from the criticisms offered in these two particular cases. And it is perhaps a measure of the legal profession's continuing interest that at the recent Naval Legal Conference held in Sydney a short time ago, 72 of the 96 lawyers present purchased a copy of this book. They're probably all busy reading it now. In chapter 20, Lieutenant Frame asked the question, why did the ships collide? And he concludes that the most probable cause was a mistaken signal. It was certainly a possibility, as there were other possibilities, but I have learned caution in being too dogmatic on those occasions when the arguments rely to a degree on supposition. The important thing, in my view, is that Tom's analysis has shown the range of things that can go wrong given the weaknesses of any technical or human link. And the prudent seafarer, being aware of these, will be doubly cautious before relaxing his vigilance for even a few seconds. He must always have in his mind an element of doubt, not only whether his ship is doing the right thing, but also whether other ships have got it right as well. Where fate calls will not be received well by all, but I think the pain and the discomfort that may be caused to some must be balanced against the benefit to those young men and women at sea today and those who will go to sea tomorrow, because neither this country nor the Navy can afford another Melbourne Voyager disaster. And I would hope that the new breed of naval officer we now have in the Australian Navy will study this book in detail, learn from it, and be better seamen for doing so. And finally, I'd say this. Whilst this book gives emphasis to the facts of a collision, 2 royal commissions, and the attendant political infighting, we should also remember the courage of such people as Chief Petty Officer Coxswain Rogers, who was awarded the George Cross for saving life at the expense of his own, Midshipman Kerry Marion, last heard swimming to the assistance of others, and electrical mechanic William Condon, who, having escaped from the forward section of the ship, went back in to help others and in so doing lost his life as well. It is that courage and dignity in the face of death that I believe is the backbone of the Navy's tradition, not the occasional human failings that litter history. And in closing, I'd like to commend Where Fate Calls to your reading and congratulate Tom Frey. Thank you very much.
Finally, to our intrepid author. It was another publisher, Sir William Collins, better known to his colleagues in his own company and indeed to the book trade as Billy Collins, who once advised his publishing team, don't publish books, publish authors. We were fortunate to meet, should I say, Dr. Tom Frey, and in a remarkably short time have come to respect both his well-reasoned and, I believe, finely balanced judgment, as well as his authority and craftsmanship as a writer. And I should just tell you that in these pretty tough economic times, it's unusual for a book to sell out before publication. Where Fate Calls has done precisely that. Tom Frey.
One of the things that I've been asked when I suppose got out talking about this book was why I should want to write it. What there should be to know about this event that was a great embarrassment for the Navy some 28 years after it had occurred. But I suppose I'm one of those people who believes that life is a search for meaning and some greater understanding. And certainly in the case of the loss of Voyager, that was something that would be achieved by the study of that horrible incident. For me, this book is a quest both for meaning and for understanding of the Navy that I joined and the Navy that I've loved for the last 13 years. And I've been privileged to enjoy a great deal of assistance and support in writing this book. And I think that this is perhaps the most appropriate time for me to acknowledge the contribution that I've received from many people and to offer my thanks to them. First of all, to thank Admiral Hudson, who, as we were going to Melbourne on an aircraft one day, heard me say, "I'm thinking about kicking around Voyager," and that's brought us to this day. He did give me permission to research within the Navy's files, and if you like, to get inside the culture of the Navy and to tell others about it when we discussed this some 3 or so years ago. I'm also grateful to him for writing forward to this book and also for agreeing to launch it today. I want to thank as well Commodore Alan Thompson, who was, he doesn't like being called my boss, but he was my boss on 2 occasions when I was writing most of this book, and I'm now working for him again and feel privileged to do so. I'm grateful to him for his guidance, for his personal support, and for the enthusiasm that he remained for this project right from the very beginning. I'm also thankful to Professor Peter Dennis and also to Dr. Roger Thompson, who were my supervisor and respectively head of department here at the Department of History at the Defence Force Academy, for their great guidance, for the advice and the general assistance that they were able to offer me. As well, I should mention Robert Hislop, and Robert's down here in front of me, who was perhaps the first person I mentioned to that I was going to write about Voyager, and who, after he tried to persuade me not to do it, was perhaps my most keen supporter. Robert is Australia's authority on naval administration, an eminently wise man, and I've been grateful for his counsel over the years. I'm also thankful to Commander Graham Wright. I call Graham my sparring partner and my sounding board on navigation and fleet work. Graham was unfortunate to have me ring him every so often and say, what would you do if you were in this situation? Or what would this look like from this position? And then to try and describe a situation with words. And Graham was ever ready to give me advice, and was also to point me in the right direction of people who could help me in the issues relating to command at sea. I'm also grateful to the families of both captains. You will read from the book that I've had some critical things to say about both men. I think it was Professor Dennis that said to me that historians do anguish over the things that they have to say about people they write about. And certainly I didn't think that was true until I thought about what I was going to say about Captain Stevens and Captain Robertson. But nonetheless, I'm grateful to the families of both captains who gave me access to family papers, and which were crucial in trying to make some sense of what happened in '64 and thereafter. I'm also grateful to the survivors, and I've dedicated this book to them, and I hope that the book is a tribute to them, because they are men in whom I stand in awe. I didn't expect to find, or to hear, or to see the things that I've heard and seen, and I've spoken to these men. I'm left in no doubt whatsoever that they continue to suffer for the things that happened on that night, and certainly that suffering was compounded by the controversy and the intrigues that followed the collision. I'm also grateful to all of those people that I interviewed, and many of them are here today as well, and to those who gave me just encouragement from time to time, day to day. And I'm also grateful to my wife Helen, who's had to put up with a lot of things since I started writing this book. Very early on in the piece, I started having a recurrent dream, and the dream consisted of standing on the bridge of Voyager, towards the back of the bridge, and it was in broad daylight, and yet they were all, it was in summer, and people wearing winter uniform, which I was quick to jump onto. And Voyager, in this dream of mine, seemed to move to starboard and then move around to port. And I looked over my shoulder, standing mythically on the bridge of Voyager, and I could see Melbourne coming. And then as the ship continued to move to port, I started to get anxious. And as the ship seemed to be about 40 to 50 seconds away from the collision, Captain Stevens, in this dream, looked over his shoulder and looked me in the eyes. And then I'd throw my arms back in the bed, wake up my wife, and think that I was perhaps getting too close to my subject. But my wife Helen has kept a constant and vigilant interest in my work, and it hasn't mattered sometimes where the work has taken me. She's supported me, and I'm grateful to her for that. I've tried to make a positive contribution to the RAN in everything that I've written about it in the last 5 to 6 years. Self-awareness is an important virtue, and I hope that my own philosophy about life being, in part, a search for meaning, is evident in this book, and that as a result of its publication, it might become a more prominent feature of naval corporate attitudes. 28 years now has passed. This book has been written, and I very much hope that this might bring to an end all of the suffering, all of the misery, and all of the controversy which has plagued this ship and its men across that period of time. I'm thankful to you all for being here today and sharing this day with me. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the formal part of, perhaps for many of you, your first launch of a book. There are a few available for sale on the stand there. There should have been a lot more, but our courier got flooded out in the National Park and couldn't get here. Again, I would like to thank Admiral Hudson and Tom Frame for speaking to this book. And in conclusion, finally, and certainly not the least, to the President and members of this mess. Thank you very much.
With Bill Beetham is the next one up. We arrived down there the long weekend to be told on the Tuesday there was no judge available. So we waited till the following Monday, which was last Monday, when we were told that he's not prepared to hear the case at this stage until the clerkship decision is handed down.
I've been a speechwriter to an admiral, and I've been writing this PhD. And I'm back doing a desk waller again. So in the sense that I'm drawing upon my own experience in a slight way, but more so the experience and the expertise I've been able to apply from the many people that I've met.
And are you going back to serve on the ships?
No, I think so. I think I hope to have a continuing diverse career.
And what's your position at the moment?
At the moment I'm a staff officer in Headquarters Australian Defence Force.
And how long did you actually serve on ships?
Oh, a couple of years. Yeah, not a great deal of time yet.
And you say 2 years at sea?
Yeah, so that's fine.
And do you want to ask how old you are?
29.
And are you from Canberra?
No, from Wollongong. I've worked in Gong, but I live now here in Canberra. This is where I call home. And I joined the Navy at 16.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Is that the end of study now?
What's that?
Is that the end of your formal study?
Yes, it is. Yeah, so I'm just going to continue on writing books I hope about the Navy.
And was that with the AMU?
No, that was with ADFA, here at the Defence Academy. Yeah.
We've been standing holding for now.
Actually, in the last 6 months, I've gone and got a boat license, commercial boat license, so Coxswain's license. So
Well, that's what I'm going to do when I get that. What, Vernon finally gets it, do we? What? Well, my missus said, if you go to that thing, you won't get one of those books, so I'm going to send the money away to Vernon and make sure you'll get one.
Officer in charge, and he was the next
down, right?
we'll get him, torpedo man. Yeah.
So you'll see
Us three live here. I've been here since the kids are 70. Driven those days before any babies.
Oh, 69. It's a good boat to get in and out of an RV.
Yeah, I was only 17. That's what they all say.
Oh, right. Now, are there again a Parliament?
Just move it on. For G-E-O-W.
G-E-O-W.
Wait a minute. No.
It'll take time. It's not, there's no replication. It's about and it's amusing. A couple of people said to me on the radio, to these, it's almost like it's good enough for a film. I said, no, I reckon that'd be about right.
Fred Austin thinks so.
Didn't? Well, you know why.
That wouldn't be an interest in time.
Yes.
We'll talk on Wednesday.
Just that man.
Oh, right.
I've got it.
Come on.
I don't believe in drinking all night. I don't believe in command, the essence of that. And no, but the thing I think about him that struck home with looking at the papers around this, there were two Duncans. There was the Duncan at sea and the one that not many people saw. And I believe Duncan got quite anxious about it. And he didn't have the world's greatest stars around. And I mean, the other thing that's so amusing is if I was going to dump on somebody, it's interesting that the David Martin stuff and all that happens to me. I was devastated by that headline.
That's good, so was I.
I took my wife and children and we went to the park and played for 3 hours. I couldn't believe it. And people have said all sorts of things to me. People said, oh, what about Captain Stevens? And I said, well, you know, Captain Stevens, it doesn't matter what you think about alcohol or anything, it had nothing to do with the collision. And I got Jess is spitting chips, about, and I'm weeping and all this sort of stuff. But it's just so, I found it so hard to, I mean, there was all the things about the people that saw Duncan at home, and the things they saw him when he was away. And, I think the person, between you and I, the person that let him down was Roger McNeil. No, he didn't want to speak, he didn't want to speak to anybody.
I read it.
He wrote to you.
And left it up to him.
He didn't even reply to us.
He should have said to Duncan. He should have said something to him. That's the thing that strikes me the most. He should have said something.
Maybe it's on his tongue. Maybe he's suffering from it.
Did you, all that kind of things, it's just no evidence. I can't understand what Chip is on about.
He's got a big log of wood in his shoulder.
Well, did you see that the chapter in there was called about the verdict on But I say now, I said, all right, well, Don Chip has now got to come out and tell us if Captain Stevens took amphetamines, how do you know about it? Because the Royal Commissions don't know about it. No one knows about it. It's just Don Chip.
Tell me, wasn't there a query about signal or...
The person in Iverson, this commission, is the tactical operator. And the ship wasn't fit to be at sea. I mean, they weren't allowed to, because I don't believe Duncan heard that last order. I don't believe he heard it. I believe the signalman heard it, relayed it to Price, Duncan overheard it, and the signal looked a bit funny. He then went down below to talk to the
I believe you there.
The two people that I put, some said, who's to blame? I said, well, Captain Stevens is responsible because he's captain of the ship. The person to blame is Price, it seems to me. I sort of watch, I think.
Yeah, we like the last paragraph at the end.
Oh, that's nice, isn't it?
Yes, it was given to me. Ken Shams read in the last few days, has read the book, and as I walked in, he, passed it to me and said, I've written that out for me. And,
print out.
And he said, this will help you through today.
Yes, I did say that, didn't I?
You must have, it's in the book.
What have you done there? He doesn't, I said a few things about him, which I don't think he agrees with.
Shams?
Yeah.
That's natural.
But, if
we're having lunch with him tomorrow.
Well, look, I still think he shouldn't have signed that Board of Inquiry thing at Subic Bay, that was all.
I don't even know what he did.
Oh, well. But again,
Alan, you've been...
We did a truck walk anyway. He would have been in it.
You can have the car or something in the top of the car park.
All right.
Is that right?
Yeah, I'll get home as soon as I can.
Just let me know what it's doing.
All right.
So I know.
Keep in touch, in other words. Yes, keep in touch.
Yeah.
Very nice seeing you.
Show
You must be very proud of me.
Yes, and
How many bar roads you wear at?
Well done.
Thanks, John.
How many bar roads you wear at?
Oh, I've only actually acquired one. This was a bit of an interview.
Yes, you have. Have you got arthritis yet?
But I would like to go to Sandy again. We're on Fair Star in May, and we're going through the Whitsundays. I'm going to try and get off. I'll talk to him and see if he can't come out from shoot and meet us.
Yes.
Because I'd love to see him and talk to him.
Yeah.
He's a fabulous bloke. I really had a great time up there with
him and Julie.
Yeah, Julie and the kids, and they wrote me a little note saying farewell Tom and all that sort of stuff, and I kept that away. I really did enjoy it. I had a good time.
Well, young Duncan,
it's his birthday.
Sandy's 41st birthday.
Yeah, I just thought it, Sandy's.
Yeah, 41.
Is he
41 today.
Oh, that's right, 28 plus 13.
Yeah, but young Duncan is only...
Oh, Dunk.
Young Dunk has just started high school.
How's he going?
And he'll be 12 on the 28th this month. And things were very confusing the Grand because of having to change classes rooms every class, every subject. And he thinks he's going to take up Japanese. It's on the curriculum and he thinks he might take it.
Is that right?
Yeah.
What does Sandy think of that?
Well, he says it's a modern age and
plus
maybe a lot of Japanese in
be owning
Queensland.
They'll own large bits of shoot, I'm sure.
Well,
and we had a day out in the reef, and it was a beautiful. I really enjoyed it. We went out in the reef and we pigged ourselves, and we had a good time. So, I really would like to tell them.
Alex, are you really talking all this?
What? What are you doing,
Tom?
Alex?
There's a couple there with my compliments you can do with what you want with them from last year.
Oh, that's me. Isn't that amazing? See, this shows you how unkind nature has been.
I know.
See the.
This is Husky.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Isn't that nice?
My pleasure.
Oh, thanks for that. And I better put them on the right.
Yes, Alex, this is the last part of the book.
I know you didn't know, Kevin, but my daughter heard about it.
Put your phone number. I'll just.
I don't. Yeah, I like it.
Putting the phone up and say,
Wait.
I've only got that far. It's powerful. Ali, come on.
Probably cost him about $200 to buy, too.
Did we all get a copy of this, Alex?
They grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them, lest we forget.
All night.
Full speed ahead.
What was it?
Full speed ahead.
And what's happening?
It's black.
What are you doing?
I'm trying to breathe underwater.
Yeah, what are you doing?
I can't get in the air.
What's happening?
I'm trying to find a way to get out.
Tonight marks the 28th anniversary of the Voyager disaster, the Navy destroyer that was sunk by the aircraft carrier Melbourne during manoeuvres off the coast of New South Wales. 82 men lost their lives in a tragic incident that remains embroiled in controversy even today. Most of the survivors are still fighting to be compensated for the psychological injuries they suffered. Some, like the men you're about to meet, have never recovered from the trauma. Peter Wilkinson reports.
One went to sea with pride for your country. You took pride in your ship. And when I see it these days, it's enough to make you cry.
I've been picked up in the street a couple of times in a week, put through hospital, and they've just thought, oh, well, he's got a problem, and they've sent me away and certified me.
I guess they probably would have preferred us to have gone like the ship, out of sight.
82 seamen died on Voyager. The reason the survivors still suffer is because, through their eyes, the Australian Navy's integrity also died with those 82 men.
The Voyager survivors almost seem to have been the forgotten men in all of this. I think there was a view that they were this great embarrassment to the Navy.
Tom Frame, a naval lieutenant who's written a book that leaves no doubt in the reader's mind that it was a dreadful malaise within the Navy that led to the Voyager tragedy. And the Navy is responsible for the suffering that continues.
Well, I think the Navy for a long time had been in decline. And when a Navy's in decline, there's a possibility that professional standards will decline as well.
Of the two ships, most of us remember the aircraft carrier. Melbourne was the Navy's jinxed ship. Planes had problems landing on her. And besides the Voyager catastrophe, there was an American destroyer sliced in two in 1969. Her name, the Frank E. Evans, and 74 Americans died.
I named this ship Voyager.
Voyager was, by all reports, a happy ship until that fateful trip 28 years ago. She had just been inadequately refitted in Victoria.
There is no question that Voyager was not ready for the exercise in which she was involved when the collision occurred. The refit was shortened. It wasn't a very effective refit. There were many, many problems.
It's just that you'll get a quick flash there, you know, just for a minute or so, you'll think about it and think about a particular person, you know, what would they be like today?
Buzzy Luttrell was a teenage radio operator on Voyager. That night, he was off duty.
I'd just gone to bed and I heard this singing, sort of half sat up, and I remember me either knocking my glasses or just hitting the bulkhead. And the next I sort of remember is I fell down a deck or something and then was blown out through an ammunition hole when the boilers blew.
It really is hard to imagine what it would have been like. There would have been a point in time when the sailors watching realised Melbourne, towering overhead, was going to hit. And then a tearing collision, 20,000 tonnes travelling at 22 knots, Melbourne sliced straight through Voyager, like a hot knife through butter.
The Navy has announced that the destroyer had 324 men on board when she went down after her nighttime collision with the carrier.
Were you alone in the bunk room?
No, our mess deck was nearly full. We would have had about, I think it held about 32 and there's about 24 in there.
And how many got out?
4 of us got out of that.
Buzzy then found himself in the oily water.
We formed a circle of about 15.
Why did you form a circle?
You could tread water while you're hanging on. So it was just a ways of keeping afloat.
And of those 15 in that circle, how many survived?
Only a couple of us. Because it was just too long. So they used one of the boats. It was tradition, and they had to find the captain first. in one of the cutters until they found his body. They weren't allowed to pick up another person. Well, a lot of blokes drowned waiting just while they were trying to find the captain. Not as often as I'd like.
28 years after the accident, to find Buzz Luttrell, you have to travel to one of the most isolated parts of Australia, Bruny Island, southeast of Tasmania. He lives alone, brain damaged and crippled through alcohol.
I don't go out. I haven't been in probably a picture show for over 30 years. I've never been to the theatre.
Why not?
Well, it didn't fit in with my lifestyle at the time. I was just, everything was revolved around booze. I'd just go in the pub and just sit there by myself.
Just 17 months after the tragedy, he was diagnosed by the Navy as a chronic alcoholic.
Oh, when I first got it was beer and top shelf, and then when I couldn't get beer and that, I heated the cleaning fluids and that. I used to have a lot of boot polish and Kero mixed together, and I had the Brasso.
You got some psychiatric counselling, didn't you, fairly quickly after the accident?
We got nothing. We didn't even get to see anything. My first account, I'd already been discharged, and I don't know how long after I'd been discharged before I was put up in, well, then it was an asylum, and even in the hospital then, it was nothing. It wasn't even brought up.
We just considered throwaways.
Gary Evans, too, was another teenager on Voyager.
I can remember the oil. I didn't realise it was oil at the time. But it was a case of trying to keep the head out of the water. If you got any in the mouth, you were trying to vomit. It just made that task of staying alive that much more difficult.
When rescuers picked Gary Evans out of the water, he had a fractured skull and multiple injuries.
I have trouble with neck and shoulders. The hands are not what they used to be. It's just part of the ongoing problems that I've had as a result of injuries received. Today, anyone's injured, they're covered for the rest of their life. But people of Voyager time, they weren't. So they're just discarded. That hurts.
And here we have the wheelhouse on the left.
If it's hard to imagine why the trauma remains so real, maybe it helps to go on board a destroyer with a man who experienced the accident.
But you see, now just thinking about it, I'm getting goosebumps.
Alex Haggerty's station was in the ship's wheelhouse, operating the port telegraph to the engine room.
The order came full speed ahead, and if I remember it correctly, I put on full speed ahead, and then there was a bang, the lights went out, the place filled up with water.
Remembering for Alex Haggerty is like peering through thick smoke. He simply can't put all the pieces together.
There was metal pieces sticking out, and I cut my hands and the back of my legs on it, and I got out through this hole, and I was looking up at a hatchway above me.
After the accident, Haggerty became a misfit. A familiar story, drinking and psychiatric problems.
I had snakes and creepy crawlers all over me, and I tore my clothes off, and I was brushing these imaginary things off my body. There was one part of my mind saying, it's not happening, you're imagining it. But the other part was screaming, and I was horrified.
How many times have you been in a psychiatric clinic?
7 or 8 times.
Had you had any particular troubles before the accident?
No, none at all. I had a very high intelligence quotient. I still have it, although I've lost about 20 points now through the drinking in the last years.
Alex Haggerty needs to see people and to be with people who can help him. And it disappoints me, I suppose, that this long after the collision, he is still suffering, and yet he seems not to be able to find a way to overcome those sufferings and to lead a normal life.
So is the Navy still responsible?
I believe the Navy has a continuing responsibility for everyone who has ever served this country in the Defence Force.
Naval historian Lieutenant Tom Frame, whose investigation of the tragedy, a book entitled Where Fate Calls, was released today. After the break, Peter Wilkinson's report continues when survivor Alex Haggerty undergoes hypnosis to discover the truth about the tragedy.
I'm drowning.
What are you doing?
I can't get in the air.
What's happening?
I'm trying to find a way to get out.
The night of February 10, 1964, marked a tragic turning point in the life of Alex Haggerty. The trauma of the collision, coupled with his subsequent questioning by senior Navy men, affected him deeply. He began to doubt that he'd followed orders correctly and even felt he could be to blame for the sinking of Voyager. Finally, Alex sought help to try to unblock his memory of the disaster.
What do you remember of the minutes before the collision?
Personally, nothing. I'm talking to you about it. You know and I know that I went through it. But here I can't believe I went through it because this barrier is closed and won't let it come out.
We're going to give you an injection to help you relax.
What Alex Haggerty wants more than anything on earth is to get better.
That feels comfortable?
He wants to be hypnotised, to be taken back 28 years to that terrible night, to confront the demons in his brain.
And let your mind go to just before the collision. A ship being split in half, many men dying, the severity of the trauma, coupled with the negative thoughts that were given to him by senior people, really caused self-doubt and ruminations. He developed an obsession and a compulsion to drink alcohol, and I think that that's just indicative of the original trauma.
Sydney doctor Alan Fay.
Let's hear how they said it.
Full speed ahead.
What was it?
Full speed ahead.
And what's happening?
And all of a sudden...
What is it?
The lights went out.
What's happening?
The lights went out. And then it filled up with water.
What's happening now?
We filled up with water. The whole wheelhouse filled up with water.
So it's black?
It's black.
What are you doing?
I'm trying to breathe underwater.
You're underwater?
I'm underwater.
How do you feel?
I'm drowning.
What are you doing?
I can't get in the air.
What's happening?
These thoughts, they rushed through my mind. Or maybe it was your fault that the Voyager went down. Maybe you turned the telegraph the wrong way.
So people have told you that you were lying?
People who weren't there.
Right.
Have told me.
And this is influencing you?
This influenced me.
How is it influencing you? What's it making you think or feel?
It makes me feel like a liar, which I wasn't. I told the truth an hour and a half after the collision.
Alex was a happy-go-lucky person before the trauma, and unfortunately the way he was questioned by senior people after the trauma put doubts into his mind and thoughts, so he was virtually hypnotised at the age of 17, and his life went off the rails, so to speak. How do you feel?
I feel good. I've just...
You followed orders?
I followed my orders.
How are the other two men in the wheelhouse?
They also followed their orders.
Okay, what's happening now? I asked Alex to view the film for the experience that he'd been through with supportive people, preferably his therapist, but also with his wife, so that he would be able to really understand what happened those many years ago.
I'm drowning.
What are you doing?
I can't get in the air.
What's happening?
I'm trying to find a way to get out.
What are you doing?
I'm thrashing around under the water.
Show me what you're doing.
I'm trying to find the door. I can't find the door, and then I find a hole with jagged metal.
The very release of the emotion in itself will help him. Coupled with that, I gave him suggestions so that his concentration, his thinking, his memory, his self-confidence, and his ability to regain control of his life, including overcoming alcohol and being able to cope well, would all improve.
I can hear nothing.
Right, you can't hear anything? Can you see anything?
I can't see anything either.
Right.
And all of a sudden I'm in a passageway.
Right.
And I can see starlight above me.
You've been through the hole with the jagged metal.
I imagine I got through the hole with the jagged metal.
You can see starlight above.
Because I have...
They need to have supportive counselling to help them wind down from these traumas and to make sure that the people do recover. It certainly shouldn't take 28 years.
I'm underwater again, I can't breathe, and then all of a sudden I'm out and I'm on the side of the Melbourne.
What's happening?
It's brushing against me.
Where are you?
In the water.
You're in the water, it's brushing against you.
It's brushing against me, and I thought if there was barnacles... Maybe if we had somebody else at the helm at that time who could have said, OK, it was our fault, we accept liability, let's help the people, and I don't mean money-wise now, I mean give them the help they needed at that time, so we wouldn't have... Some committed suicide, others like me ended up as drinkers. If they'd have helped us at the right time, they could have saved the whole ship.
It happened 28 years ago to the minute while we're on air tonight. Welcome to this special report on the Voyager disaster, one of the most traumatic episodes in Australia's peacetime history. Perhaps only the Chamberlain case can match it for notoriety. Certainly no other calamity has inspired 2 royal commissions. The destroyer HMAS Voyager was sunk by her flagship, the aircraft carrier Melbourne, during manoeuvres off the New South Wales coast on the 10th of February 1964. 82 sailors died, many of them teenagers on their first voyage. The survivors are now middle-aged or older. Many have never been able to come to terms with the horrific events of that night. In this program, we piece together the final minutes before the fatal collision and trace the bitter years of neglect that have been the cruel legacy of HMAS Voyager. The Navy hymn implores the Almighty to care for those in peril on the sea. But when the ocean claimed these men's ship, it was not an act of God. Their peril was man-made, a calamity that cruelly stole their mates' lives and will forever haunt their own.
The thing that unnerved me most of all was when the ship turned up on its end and started to slide under. The cries of those that were trapped inside. It was a most horrific experience. If you've ever seen a movie called The Cruel Sea, men are trapped below and their screams come up through the voice pipe to the bridge. The captain has to, for his own sanity, close the cover on the voice pipe to try and shut out those screams of the trapped men. It's not something that's easy to describe.
You feel a great sense of loss. You've lost not only your best mate, but you've lost your home. And it was our home. We lived on that ship, you know. So you'd lost your home, you lost your mate, you lost all your clobber, and it was like being turned out into the snow with nothing, and with no friends to guide you and help you. And it's a fairly empty sort of a feeling.
The survivors of the Voyager disaster have had to live with that loss for nearly 3 decades. Some have been drowning in a sea of despair, while the Navy seemed interested only in saving face. For some, the burden has been unbearable. Careers, marriages, fortunes have gone under as surely as Voyager. Many feel betrayed by the country they sought to serve.
I won't ever forgive them for what they did. I mean, it was bad enough, the collision, the way I was treated following it, the way I was thrown aside like a dirty sock. There was no further use to them. The way they tried to destroy me, the way they destroyed indirectly my family, and the way they've completely changed my whole life. I was expendable.
The whole thing seems to have been some sort of a massive cover-up, whitewash, whatever you want to call it, and that the poor plebs, the survivors of Voyager, are the ones that are going to wear it on behalf of all these other people. So to me, the whole thing has just been a complete and utter travesty of justice.
They curly roughs on me.
The survivors have endured far more than tragedy at sea. The stress of an unprecedented 2 royal commissions and endless legal argument has also taken its toll. Some are old men now, some prematurely old. Still, they fight for justice and compensation. The ordeal seems never-ending, the trauma always just below the surface.
Christ.
You can see it in their faces as they clamber over these disturbingly familiar decks. This is Voyager's sister ship, Vampire, a carbon copy of the ill-fated destroyer.
I should have been in that room over there.
Yeah.
The Vampire is a maritime museum piece now, safely tied up at Sydney's Darling Harbour. But the old sailor's thoughts transported them in an instant back out to sea, to a black night 28 years ago off Jarvis Bay.
That's about where she is, just a little bit.
Yeah, I think it would have been just about there. So all that scarring on the bow of the Melbourne would have been right where she hit that bloody thing and smashed the fluke off that anchor. Geez, no wonder they're all fucking killed on the bridge, right? Christ.
Among those on Voyager's bridge that fateful February night was Captain Duncan Stevens. He went down with his ship. But efforts to keep afloat his and the Navy's reputation have long muddied the waters of the Voyager tragedy.
The cause or causes of the collision that occurred on the 10th day of February 1964 between the ships of the Australian Navy, Melbourne and Voyager.
The senior service tackled the formal inquiries into the disaster with a vigour distinctly lacking from the survivors' cause. Naval staff suppressed unwanted evidence and lied under oath. 28 years and 2 royal commissions on, the Voyager tragedy is still shrouded in anguish and controversy. The motto of HMAS Voyager means where fate calls. None could have expected fate to call that February day in 1964 when she sailed from Jarvis Bay to resume a routine naval exercise off the coast. It was peacetime, in familiar waters, in the comforting shadow of her flagship, the carrier Melbourne. In fact, they were just hours away from Australia's greatest peacetime military disaster. The man in charge of the operation was Melbourne's captain, John Robertson. In the gathering gloom, Melbourne and Voyager made final preparations for night flying exercises. The 10th of February 1964 was a clear, moonless night. Winds were light, so under Captain Robertson's direction, the two ships began making tandem turns, angling for the most favourable breeze in the fluky conditions.
07, this is 44.
At 8:52, Robertson signalled to Voyager to immediately take up its normal shadowing position behind the carrier. Voyager acknowledged the signal. In the darkness, Melbourne's captain followed the destroyer's movements by her navigation lights. At first, Voyager behaved predictably, banking away from the carrier. Then suddenly, Voyager swung back towards the Melbourne. They were just a minute away from collision, but watching from the carrier, Robertson believed that Voyager had chosen a fishtailing course which would still allow her to pass safely astern. It was only 10 or 15 seconds later, when Voyager showed no hint of deviation, that Melbourne's navigator was first to realise something was badly wrong.
Christ, what's Voyager doing? Stop both engines, half astern both engines.
The port watch on Voyager, 19-year-old Brian Sumter, was the first person on the bridge to see the Melbourne bearing down on his ship.
Melbourne came around, or appeared to come around our quarterdeck and steam up our port side, and I'd reported it, and I looked around, and that's when I saw the officer of the watch drop his binoculars, and I thought he gave the order full ahead both engines. And when I looked back at the Melbourne, it was coming, or appeared to be coming straight at us.
Over the main broadcast came collision stations. I jumped from my bunk down onto the deck. I tried to go up the ladder. I got halfway up the ladder when the actual collision occurred, and I was thrown back down onto the deck.
One almighty bloody crash. All the lights went out, totally black, not a light anywhere, and somehow, I don't know how, but I've got down there. And I haven't got a bloody clue how I got from here to there in an upside-down ship in pitch black with bodies everywhere as well. It's got me knackered.
The ship went over to the side. This catwalk here come down, obviously hit me and pushed me against the guardrail and pinned me there. And the ship went over, we went underwater and sort of come back. When we come back, it seemed like an eternity we were down there. When we came back, they cut me out. The guys come along, cut me out with a hacksaw.
I went cartwheeling across the wardroom over there into that side of the bulkhead on that side of the ship. And I wasn't really sure what was happening, because the next thing I recall was I was surfing out through the ship's side on a wave, and I was outside the ship.
I remember being in the water, but being driven through the water. It was an awful experience. There was arms and legs, and I can remember trying to grab hold of a couple of people. We must have been tangled up in an awful mess, but I couldn't hang on to anybody. I don't know whether I was trying to stop them or trying to stop me, to be quite honest, but I was just being just driven through the water. I fell out onto the floor here, and by the time I got up, we had turned over, and that escape hatch was open up, and that's where I escaped through with 22 others. And the young fellow we left behind is behind those lockers there.
We found that the door, the hatch was jammed because the metal bar and the wheel and everything, the mechanism on it was jammed. And a small guy, got hold of one of the ends of these bunks and this actual bar here and broke it off. Probably through pure fear, adrenaline, whatever. Jammed it in the wheel and sheared the whole thing off. It fell out, board, and water poured in. Now, the water poured in, we were sort of standing around here, and we could hear the guys in the cafe trying to get out. We could hear them trying to get out of the cafe, and the noise of the water and all the sound of the ship and everything sinking and crashing around us, we could still hear guys in that cafe trying to get out. We could hear the coxswain in there, we could hear him talking to them and praying, and then later on, as they started a hymn, I got out through the escape hatch and got out into the sea.
The coxswain heard by Andy Matthews was Chief Petty Officer Jonathan Rogers. His photograph shows he was an ample man, too big in fact to negotiate an escape hatch. He went down with the forward section of Voyager. But not before he'd pushed as many young sailors as he could through the hatch to safety. He was posthumously awarded the George Cross for outstanding bravery. Memories of the courage and sacrifice and sheer terror among their shipmates that dreadful night 28 years ago weigh heavily on the survivors to this day.
I could hear a lot of yelling from guys trying to open the emergency escape hatch, and it just wouldn't open, and that was continuing for quite a long time. Everyone yelling out, you know, can you get it open, get it open. Finally, the escape hatch opened, and the guys were going out, but my leg was still stuck. And it was then that you could hear the enormous roar of the water coming up through the canteen. And it was just literally tearing all the aluminium structures, the tables and the chairs, going everywhere. The noise that was the most vivid impression that I had, was the noise. Finally, anyway, my foot came free, and I worked my way across to the escape hatch. And there was everyone that I know had got out, but there was still one young bloke at the escape hatch. And I asked him why he was still there, and he said, I can't swim. And
I was ordered by a petty officer electrician, who's also dead, to get the duty electrician up forward to the gyro room. Nobby Clark's bunk was down here, and young Nobby had to go, and we never saw him again to this day. And I certainly feel that if I hadn't given him that order, he would have been alive today. A dream is sending Nobby up there and, you know, killing him. That's my dream. And leaving young Sir Namuel behind. Because we tried very hard to get him out. But when you have only got 3 minutes, there's not much you can do.
The recurring nightmare of Bernie Verweyen is a well-documented phenomenon among these survivors with its own special name.
There was a recognised Voyager syndrome. It was recognised within the Navy, even though it wasn't an official title. They were singled out as being different, and they felt different. 1/4 of the crew was lost in a matter of about 15 minutes or less, and a ship's company is a very tight company, and there were a lot of young people on board. I think 50% of them were, or if not more than 50%, were on their first voyage, so they were between 17 and 19 years old. So that loss and grief and guilt, particularly with the senior petty officers and chief petty officers who felt responsible for these young kids, is a very potent thing for them.
82 men were entombed in the Voyager. 232 men managed to escape the stricken ship, but their ordeal was by no means over. Melbourne hit Voyager just behind the bridge and cut her in two. This last murky photograph shows the destroyer's rear section, which stayed afloat till past midnight. All losses were in the forward section, which was gone in just 3 minutes. Only 3 bodies were recovered: the Voyager's captain, Stevens, the officer of the watch, and the navigator. When Captain Robertson on Melbourne signalled news of the disaster, he was unaware of the terrible loss of life. Prime Minister Menzies was informed shortly before midnight that there'd been a collision. At 18 minutes past midnight, Robertson sent the message naval brass had dreaded, shocking in its terseness. Nothing like this had ever happened to the Royal Australian Navy before.
What happened to the Voyager after the collision?
She broke in half round our bows, and the two halves floated down one either side of the ship. The bows sank very quickly, and the stern lasted an hour or two.
My father waiting for me, and I needed to see him. And I was a little worried, in a sense, about speaking to him because he'd been an ex-boxer and he was a hard, unemotional man, so I thought. And much to my surprise, his eyes filled with tears, and I got a very big shock. Although I was glad to see him. But I needed to share with him what had happened because he would understand.
As it all turned out, I had a fractured nose, fractured through my cheekbone, fractured through this part of my skull here, fractured dislocation of my shoulder, fractured ribs, and I was pretty black and blue.
It took time to reveal the full extent of Tug Wilson's injuries. After being crushed beneath a collapsed catwalk, Wilson had struggled back to his post in Voyager's sickbay to get medical supplies for desperate shipmates. They finally had to put him over the side. It's a miracle he lived to see the British Empire medal he earned for his heroic efforts that night.
I spent about 6 months in hospital in all, about 7 or 8 operations. Rebuilt my nose, which took a bit of doing, and took bone out of my face and put a screw in my shoulder.
Sailors with less severe injuries were sent home for some much-needed R&R. After just 1 week's survivor's leave, it was back to the ship, a new home, with new relationships to forge, and the old ones forever playing on the mind. Some couldn't cope.
Well, I received survivor's leave, and then I was drafted back to Vendetta, which is the sister ship of Voyager, and was put in this same mess deck and this same bunk, which actually didn't go down too well at all.
I just said I just couldn't go back. I just couldn't handle going back and maybe seeing the same thing happen again. So I was transferred to Navy Office Canberra for 12 months and then discharged with acute anxiety neurosis. And that was my naval career finished.
Tug Wilson, singled out for outstanding courage in the Voyager tragedy, is made of sterner stuff than most. Once his injuries healed, he resumed his naval career.
I was all right. It had no, and I believe it had no psychological effect on me, which it probably did. It had physical effects on me, yes, certainly. And I had no problems till I went to the Melbourne in 1969, until we sliced the Evans in half. And that knocked the hell out of me. The second collision was the one that affected me psychologically. I refused to go below decks. I slept in the sick bay. The life jackets were there and the lifeboat was right beside there. And I slept there. And I said, when we got into Singapore, I said, you can kiss my ass goodbye because as soon as this ship gets back to Australia, I'm going off it.
Still, Tug Wilson stuck with the Navy until his ravaged body finally could take no more.
In 1978, I was discharged physically unfit for naval service, considered unfit for gainful employment, with a chest condition. I applied for compensation, and in the course of my compensation claim, they said, there is nothing wrong with your chest, it's all in your head, you're a neurotic. I was never seen by a naval psychiatrist. I was never counselled by a naval psychiatrist or psychologist.
From the outset, the survivors' plight was overshadowed by official preoccupations with the 2 royal commissions that were to dominate public attention over the next 3 years. The legal process prolonged and aggravated the trauma of the men. As the Navy fought to salvage its pride, the Voyager disaster entered a new phase.
The upshot of the whole legal process is that I'm genuinely sorry that I told the truth. I would have been better served in terms of me personally and what was left of my career in telling them what they wanted to hear. It was a mistake on my part to tell the truth as I knew it.
It became clear very early in the Voyager saga that the Navy had no intention of going down with the ship. The unfortunate captain of Voyager, Duncan Stevens, should have been the obvious focus of their inquiries. But if Stevens was shown to have been disastrously unsuitable for the job, it would reflect badly on the people who gave him his command, the Navy Board. The well-connected Stevens had many people interested in defending his reputation. But the naval top brass did not want to hear what Stevens' fellow officers had known all along, that Voyager's captain was incompetent. Among them was one of Australia's most distinguished sailors, the late New South Wales Governor and former Admiral Sir David Martin. Shortly before he died, the much-admired Martin confided that he had lied under oath to the Royal Commissioners because he'd been told not to rock the boat. His confidant was naval historian Tom Frame.
Admiral Martin said, well, his answers weren't true. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, it's bullshit. And I said, I don't understand. And he said, Captain Stevens on the bridge was hopeless, that he needed others around him, that he needed a second opinion, that he really perhaps wasn't competent to be there. And David Martin said to me, the most well-working ship, the ship with the greatest teamwork that he'd ever been in, was Voyager, because the wardroom worked so well together to make up for what they thought were the deficiencies of their own captain.
In the Navy's efforts to shield Captain Stevens, other reputations became expendable.
There was counsel there for the Navy, but that's who they were representing, the Navy, not the naval personnel, in my view anyway. You know, I felt that it was boots in and all, and without someone there to look after your own particular interests, especially where some accusations were being made, was pretty tough.
On Voyager's bridge, a raw 20-year-old, Gary Evans, took the crucial signals from Melbourne on the fateful night. He found the public cross-examination of his role almost as traumatic as the collision itself.
It was suggested that I was the cause of the accident by misinterpreting signals, or misinterpreting information to the officer watch.
To say that he is in some way responsible for the collision, I think, is to misunderstand command at sea and the way naval responsibility works. It's true that each individual is responsible for the actions.
Navy historian Tom Frame believes there was indeed a mix-up over Melbourne's signal, but he says the Navy knew it was absurd to shoot the messenger.
ship safety remains always the responsibility of the captain and the officer of the watch, his delegated responsibility in his absence. So if the tactical operator on Voyager's bridge makes a mistake which happens in the heat of an operation which was speeding up, it's up to the captain, the officer of the watch, or other responsible officers who are there to detect that mistake and to take the avoiding action. They ought not simply to rely on his performance. They ought to be checking, rechecking, because they have an enormous responsibility, that of the ship and every person in that ship.
When another humble seaman stepped forward to back Voyager's young signaller, his reputation also came under fire.
There were rumours about my sexuality. There were rumours about my drinking habits. There were rumours about my competence or lack of it. And that attitude and philosophy filtered down, if you like, to other sailors, to the point where I was being completely ostracised. Guys that I'd known for years would cross the street rather than talk to me. It was very unpleasant. I found out subsequently that they actually had a psychiatrist sitting at the back of the court listening to me while I gave evidence to determine whether I was sane or not.
They quite simply tried to discredit me by attributing motives to me which were totally false.
Ex-Lieutenant Commander Peter Caban is another victim of the Voyager fallout. Although he'd left the ship and the Navy a month before the collision, he was soon swept up in the tragedy.
Well, I visited all the survivors who were hospitalised at Balmoral. And while I was there, I expressed my concern and particularly my distress at the captain being killed. And one of the patients in the ward said categorically that he was drunk at the time. And I was appalled at that. And another said, I've known worse captains, but I can't remember who. And that really did distress me because I knew that the captain had never drunk at sea, and I was sure he never would.
Lieutenant Commander Caban knew better than most that the captain liked to drink. As executive officer on Voyager, he'd seen Stevens the worse for wear on more than one occasion. But Caban remained convinced that Stevens would never drink at sea until he heard the captain's cabin steward, Barry Hyland, testify that Stevens ordered a triple brandy shortly before the collision.
Served him out about 7:15, I think, and I was asked to supply the captain and Captain Stevens a drink. And I served him that brandy. A triple brandy. There was a triple liqueur glass brandy and a 10-ounce glass of water. I gave him the brandy, there's no doubt about that. I gave him the brandy, whether they believe me or not, but they weren't very supportive, I can tell you that.
I didn't know what to believe at that stage. It was when his evidence was established and I thought of the consequences of the truth of it.
Although the First Royal Commission blamed Voyager for the collision, Captain Stevens escaped personal criticism. But Melbourne's captain, the late John Robertson, was criticised for failing to avoid the collision. He lost his command and left the Navy a broken man. Robertson's demise propelled Peter Caban into the role of whistleblower.
I felt that Robertson was being railroaded, that somebody was suppressing the truth. I explained chapter and verse a whole series of incidents where Captain Stevens, in my presence and through my observation or hearsay, had drunk excessively ashore, and even to the extent that I had actually confronted him and said that I wouldn't tolerate him drinking at sea because he'd lose the ship.
When a witness emerged who could support some of Caban's allegations, the Secretary to the Navy encouraged him not to come forward.
I remember getting a phone call, and I think it was...
Voyager's medical officer, Michael Tiller, recalls what happened when the Navy Secretary rang him in London about his comments.
I made, because I gather they were going to be put into a blue paper or green paper, I think it was a blue paper for Parliament. And I said that I wasn't particularly keen to be involved in any dirty washing. I thought there was been a terrible tragedy and a lot of people were being very badly hurt. And it was put to me by Landau that, well, in that case, would you mind if we destroyed your comments? Well, I said, of course I wouldn't mind, because I was unaware of what was going on in Australia, and I thought, well, these comments are just comments by me. Yes, if you want to destroy them, you can. But this goes against the grain a bit, because I was under the impression that it was said that I wanted them destroyed. I think it was put to me, would I like them destroyed? And I said, yes, for reasons of not hurting people, I said, yes, go ahead and destroy them.
Despite the Navy's obstruction, the second inquiry, unlike the first, was unequivocal in blaming Voyager for the collision. It strongly suggested Voyager's captain, Stevens, was not up to the job, confirming an alcohol habit and an active stomach ulcer. But it stopped short of finding that Stevens was unfit for command on the crucial night of the disaster, or that he was directly responsible. The finding is a continuing disappointment to lawyer and once vitally interested politician Ted St John QC.
They gave a number of instances where Stevens had behaved in a very odd fashion indeed, if he were a good, sober man, and yet somehow they resisted the conclusion that he was in fact a drunkard. But the other remarkable thing is that, having found that he was incapable, they never addressed the question whether that incapacity was causally related to the disaster, for which there seemed to be no other rational explanation.
28 years on, the search for blame has darkened many careers and obscured what actually happened on Voyager's last night at sea. Historian Tom Frame believes he's finally pieced together a detailed reconstruction of the tragic chain of events that sank Voyager.
And I believe that the collision occurred because Voyager corrupted a signal somewhere on her bridge from Melbourne, which made her believe that Melbourne was turning around to the west under Port Wheel.
At 8:52 p.m, Melbourne and Voyager are steaming north, just over a kilometre apart, with Voyager ahead of the carrier. Melbourne signals Voyager to take up a new position behind the carrier, staying on a course of 20 degrees.
Make to Voyager, we will fly on 020.
Aye, aye, sir. 07, this is 44.
The actual signal was sent from Melbourne as being Foxtrot Corpin 020 TAC 22.
But according to Lieutenant Frame, on the bridge of Voyager, the signal is mistakenly relayed as a command to both ships to swing from their course of 20 degrees to a new course of 220 degrees.
Turn to 220 TAC 22. I say again, turn to 220 TAC 22.
Roger.
Believing that Melbourne is also turning west, Voyager alters course accordingly. When Melbourne in fact continues on its intended course, Voyager crosses into her path. If the officers on Voyager's bridge were doing their job, in Tom Frame's view, the confused signal would not have been fatal.
What should have happened was that Lieutenant Price and Captain Stevens and the navigator and anyone else who was there should have been observing Melbourne's movements. That then would have been apparent to them that Melbourne had not done as Voyager thought she was going to do, and therefore the corrupted signal would have been apparent to them, and they could have initiated avoiding action a long time before a dangerous situation had developed.
Bridge!
Pull ahead both engines, wheel hard to starboard! Pull ahead both engines, wheel hard to starboard!
At the Voyager Memorial Park alongside Jarvis Bay, children romp blissfully unaware of the events not far out to sea which brought them their play park. It was all so long ago, the 82 men who died would be old enough to be their grandfathers. Such a gentle legacy, with its scenes of family contentment, is also a poignant reminder of Voyager's living victims.
If I had had counselling directly after the sinking of the Voyager, I believe that I perhaps still would have had a family. And that makes me bloody angry.
No one to know us. We were just dirty dish rags discarded.
There you were, you left like a pigeon on a loft. Same as these blokes that are going through now for their bloody claims. The same freaking thing. No one wants to know you.
More than 80 Voyager survivors are still waiting for some compensation for their suffering. In the aftermath of the disaster, just over £100,000 was paid out in death benefits to people who lost a provider. A grand total of £3,000 was also awarded for physical injuries. But for scores of men enduring deeper trauma, there was nothing.
I went through severe depression. You don't want to do anything. You can't even sit down and concentrate on a TV program if it's any more than, say, a half an hour. You don't read books. All you think about, you don't think about anything. You just bloody sit down and do nothing. It's a mindless state.
I was suffering from anxiety neurosis, and after seeing a number of doctors in Canberra, one day when I came to work, after 5 months having moved my family down there, I found I was discharged to shore with a week's notice, physically unfit for naval service. And as I had a week's leave due, I really had 1 day's notice to leave the Navy. So out of the blue, without any counselling or support or assistance or help to get another job, I was told I didn't have a job. And this was quite devastating to my wife and family, because we thought, oh, well, perhaps they're going to just leave me in a shore job. And in fact, I've worked down there with the Navy officers as a civilian ever since, so obviously they could have done so. But no, they seemed determined to get rid of me.
While they're young, they're virile and strong and fit physically comparatively, and they can keep it under their hats. But as they get older, they tend to have more difficulty, and so it's been found with war veterans after the Second World War, and again with Vietnam veterans, it's when people start approaching middle age and getting into middle age that they find much more difficulty in coping with the symptoms.
For 17 years, the Voyager survivors' plight was ignored, until a small-town lawyer in the picturesque but unlikely setting of Victoria's Ovens Valley stumbled across their predicament. James Taylor persuaded the government not to contest a damages action, even though others were bound to follow.
They admitted liability and said, look, this is our stance with the Voyager survivors. We'll be admitting liability and we'll not be pleading the statute of limitations. Go ahead and issue your writs. If your people are reasonable in their approach to settlement, they wouldn't be adverse to that sort of procedure either.
In the event, just 3 cases would be settled in 5 years for an average payout of $280,000. Then the well of compassion ran dry.
All I was told by members of the Attorney General's Department that they had changed their mind and that they would fight every single case. We were not going to get away with it that easily.
The bureaucrat in Canberra that I was dealing with, I was just strung along for, I think, months and months. And in the end, I had a conversation with him and I said, look, why are you doing this? And he just said, look, read between the lines, Jim. It's Maralinga. And I said, well, what's Maralinga got to do with the Voyager survivors? For goodness sake, you've made this promise. These people deserve to be treated properly. What's that got to do with these men? Well, Maralinga, and I, well, read between the lines, and I suppose what he meant was, well, if we want to do the right thing by you, but if we do, we might open the floodgates. We've sort of had another look at it.
I can't see why Cabinet, in fact, can't right now just say to the Attorney-General's Department, look, stop just trying to protect the revenue. These people have clearly lost something. Do something about it.
Guess where the sick bay is? We just found the emergency battery bay. Emergency, wrap.
The sick bay is where we said it was. There we are.
It's on the port side?
Yeah, it's on the right side.
It's not on the right side, it's on the port side.
On the port left side.
At this stage, the best hope for these veterans of the Voyager saga looks to be a change of government. After 3 decades of whistling in the wind, they must be wholly cynical about any political promise. But they have a written commitment from Shadow Attorney-General Andrew Peacock to remove the key legal obstacle to their claims by again suspending the statute of limitations. The present Attorney-General, Michael Duffy, would not even discuss the Voyager survivors' claims with Four Corners.
I joined the Navy to defend Australia. I didn't join it because it was a good job. I was prepared to go to war. Had we been at war, and this had happened, then I don't think there would have been such severe psychological effects. The point is, we weren't at war. The Navy, or the Commonwealth rather, insists on treating us as civilians, but won't let us have civilian remedies. If we're ex-servicemen who were hurt in the course of our duty, then give us those entitlements that we would have had been at war. They can't have it both ways.
Gathered to remember their dead. Former colleagues were reunited at a memorial service on the New South Wales coast. Some hadn't seen each other since the night of the fatal collision in 1964.
The Voyager disaster left a deep scar on these survivors and on the Australian conscience. 82 men were left dead when the aircraft carrier Melbourne ploughed into the destroyer during peacetime manoeuvres off Jervis Bay.
I was just standing there. Next minute I was in the water, you know.
Because I was blown out to an ammunition hole.
Quick march!
102 survivors marched today to remember the tragic accident 30 years ago this Thursday.
Let us pray.
Following the service, wreaths were laid and traditional military honours observed. Formalities over, old friends were pleased to catch up, but the hurt remains. In the final analysis, the Voyager disaster was a result of human failure.
As a matter of fact, when you pulled me up, I was just going over to see a young lady to chase up a survivor that I haven't seen since the night of the collision.
You sort of don't know whether to enjoy yourself or not. You try to, but...
Survivors came from Germany and the United States. Others travelled from Perth and Port Douglas. A strong sense of comradeship has been vital to the survival of these men. The Navy has admitted it never really understood the tragedy they faced, and the government only offered them compensation last year. Last tributes paid, all agreed this was a particularly special service, unlikely to be matched again.
And now with news in
time disasters. 82 men on board the destroyer HMAS Voyager lost their lives in a collision with the aircraft carrier HMAS Melbourne. The tragedy stunned the country and shattered the lives of many who survived. Over the weekend, we joined the survivors, friends and family for a reunion to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the sinking.
They came from all over the place, from Melbourne to Milwaukee, to reunite in the pretty little town of Huskisson. A bit slower in step, a bit thinner on top than when they were comrades in arms a generation ago, but still bound together by fate and an event that stunned the country. It was called the Voyager disaster.
The sinking of the Voyager ranks as one of our greatest peacetime disasters. In all, 82 men died just hours after she sailed from here, Jervis Bay on the New South Wales south coast. Many of those were on their first voyage. Many of them were just teenagers.
Some 230 crew were rescued. One indelible image, the forlorn flagship HMAS Melbourne limping back to Sydney.
How old were you?
I was 17-year-old.
Duncan Fletcher, like most on the HMAS Voyager, has vivid memories of the collision.
It seemed like all hell broke loose, you know, just screaming of metal and the mast falling down on top of us and the funnel and everything falling down on top of us, the gangplank, and I can remember hitting the torpedo tubes.
He passed out, but somehow survived.
I must have come to at different stages, and I can remember hitting things, and I remember hitting the guardrails, or what I thought was the guardrails, and I wrapped my arms around them, and that's where they found me, wrapped around the guardrails. If that part of the ship hadn't come up, I'd still be hanging on.
At 28 and a petty officer, Jeff Worth was a veteran in comparison. His composure in the chaos won him the British Empire Medal.
All the lights went out, and the ship heeled over to starboard badly, and at no time had I lost confidence in the ship regaining stability, and I let it be known that the ship would come back.
What did you say?
I said, don't worry, she'll come back. She'll come back, and of course it didn't.
And of course there were the women, the wives like Coral Cullen, who waited anxiously for the news.
They've done an injustice to the survivors and the widows. Well, you don't put a price on a man's life. Tell the kids their father had died and they're not telling me he's coming home.
If an ocean of tears has been shed down the decades, a few more were inevitable on Saturday night, when the biggest reunion of survivors, widows, family and friends got underway.
Oh, how's life?
Many had literally not seen each other for 30 years. It was a time to reminisce about the good times.
Like spaghetti. That was in Singapore in 1963. Yeah.
And of course, the old ship was never far away.
The Voyager was one of the... she was a class ship. She was the one that, you know, even when she went down, you know, we had the decks and all beautiful. We started the yacht race.
It was certainly the biggest and, for many, perhaps the happiest reunion. Their battle for just compensation, so shamefully opposed by past federal governments, has been, for most, honourably settled. And while that's a relief, the scars remain.
For those who died on Voyager, the end was relatively quick. Cut in half by the Melbourne, the bow section sank within minutes. But for many survivors, the nightmare was just beginning.
Straight after the Voyager, we all got the feeling that we were a thorn in their side. We all had that same feeling, that they wanted to sweep us under the carpet and get rid of us.
I could honestly say I haven't slept really well ever since that night. At times, occasionally it comes back to me.
Flashbacks?
Yes, flashbacks occasionally.
Describe them to me. What sort of things?
Well, I just sort of think of when the collision occurred and the noise, and sometimes the human noises, the people that were in distress.
Calling for help?
Yes, calling for help, and in my own mind I know full well they couldn't have been helped.
For Duncan Fletcher, the crunch came when he was reassigned to patrol boats and sent once more on manoeuvres with HMAS Melbourne.
In 1969, I was on the patrol boats, little coastal patrol boats, and we went out to do exercises, and we come across the Melbourne, and I just had a complete nervous breakdown. I can't remember. I can remember seeing the Melbourne, and then I just can't remember anything after that. And 3 weeks later, I was medically discharged out of the Navy.
But at yesterday's memorial service, the years of bitterness were forgotten as old mates caught up with far-flung friends.
How far have you come to be here today?
I've come from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the United States, which is about 80 miles north of Chicago.